Benedict. It was the Solemnity of St Benedict. And it would normally be the seventh Sunday after Pentecost. And obviously it's a great thing, obviously, that the chapel's been named after St Benedict, because he's one of the great patriarchs of the spiritual life, of Western monasticism. And so whenever we think of St Benedict, we ought to be able to view him in terms of being one of the great patriarchs, like almost on the same level as the great patriarchs of the Old Testament. And when I was reading through St Butler's Lives of the Saints, it viewed him more as like a Moses or an Abraham or something like that, of one of the great patriarchs of the Old Testament. But St Benedict becomes one of the great patriarchs of the New Testament. And as Moses was a great teacher, a great lawgiver, he was one who basically pulled the Israelite people together. He gave them a spiritual life, he gave them a priesthood, he gave them a sacrificial life, he gave them the worship of the one true God. He gave them the law, he gave them the Ten Commandments. In a sense, St Benedict did the same for the Western Church, and particularly for Western monasticism. That he was the one who came through and gave the Church, the Western monasticism, and gave them a true way, a proper way of being a Catholic, or being a Christian. Because obviously the way of St Benedict is the way of perfection, is the way of holiness. And it is so that Christians can live out their Christian way of life in the world around them, particularly if they become oblates. If they become Benedictine oblates, they live out their Christian way of life in the world around them. Obviously, St Benedict, or the rule of St Benedict, was based upon the Eastern Fathers, particularly the Desert Fathers, and also the life of St John Cassian. So if you really want to have a good read, find a book on St John Cassian, his conferences and his seminars, and they're very insightful. They're very insightful for people. But obviously, as we know that St Benedict, being one of the founders of Western monasticism, came from a fairly wealthy family, and he went to study in Rome. When he got into Rome, he realized the materialism. He realized the immorality of Rome and the people of Rome, and the way that people were living their lives. They're living very, very sinful and very, very base lives. And St Benedict had a conversion, obviously to Christianity, but for it to be on a much deeper level. And so he turned his back on the modern world in the modern way, and then he went out into the wilderness and he lived in a cave. And that he stripped himself of all materialism and all sinfulness and so forth. And it was there that he, in a sense, broke the back of the devil in his life, so to speak. That's where he broke his back, so to speak. So obviously by God's grace, but that he wasn't going to be living a material, sinful, carnal, wicked way of life. He was going to basically put the devil in his place. He was going to put the demons in his life. He was going to put them in his place. And obviously he found that through solitude, through silence, through prayer, through mortification, through penance. And he basically took on a penitential way of life. And we often think that these ways are only for the monks. Or we think that these ways are only for the holy people who live in churches. But this way is for all of us. Because the way of St Benedict is the way of perfection. And that we're all called to the way of perfection. And obviously, you can find this in other ways as well. Like, I'm not saying this is the only way. I'm not saying this is the way. We should really change that word "the" to a way. Because obviously there are other good ways as well. But for us as Catholics and Benedictines here, is a way for us. And obviously, in the way of St Benedict, the first step to humility is obedience. Obedience to God, obedience to the church, obedience to our superiors, obedience to the rule, and also obviously obedience to God, but also like obedience to our resolutions. And so if we're going to make a resolution in our spiritual life, that there's something that we're going to try to conquer in our life, then we need to be obedient to that. And one of the issues that we can have a lot of the times is that when everything's going really good with God, we put a resolution up here. And when things are going really bad with us and God and our prayer life and that type of stuff, instead of actually looking up, we start to tear down. And we start to tear down. And we tear it down to the base level. As far as we can tear it down. But if we go down that path, we're going down to the path to, like I don't want to say hell, but you're tearing down the good work that God had started in your life. Because we set a resolution when we were very, very close to God, and that's the resolution where God wanted you to be. But through our own folly, we then tear down the good work that God started in our life, and we tear it down. Because obviously that's what the devil wants you to do. He wants to tear it down. He doesn't want you to sitting up there, because sitting up there is too close to God. So he wants to tear it down, and so often we're complicit in that tearing down of the good work that God has started in your life. So that whole sense of being obedient to what God would want us to do. And one of the 12 steps that we really need to take seriously as Christians, as Catholics, but also people who are wanting to walk the way of St Benedict, is that we need to have a holy fear of God and a deep sorrow for our past sins. Because sometimes we can actually glory in our past sins. We can almost think that our past sins were great, and the way that we're living now is equally bad. Because in other words, we've thrown off the shackles of the sin in our life, and now we're caught up in this hard life of being a Catholic. But we need to have a great sorrow for our past sins, that we really wouldn't want to be going down that path again. And we have to have a renunciation of our own will, because so often our own will is very carnal, is very sinful, is very willful. But obviously we need to have a renunciation of our own will and to accept the will of God in our life. And that we want to fulfill the will of God in our daily life, bit by bit. And the other point, which was obviously the other thing I was picking up on just before, is to have that ready obedience. In other words, that we obey. And this is a test of our humility. It's a test of our humility. Because obviously we don't want to be obeying, and particularly we don't really want to be obeying the people that are above us, so to speak. Like we have a habit of just cutting people off at the ankles or at the knees, so to speak. But we need to have that ready obedience, because it is obviously it's a sign of our humility, that we're prepared to lower ourselves. And then we need to have patience. Patience, particularly in our suffering, in our difficulties, in our hardships, when things aren't going our way, so that we need to have that patience also to have that sense of joy, that sense of joy that when a cross is given to us, and that we're prepared to carry that cross patiently and joyfully. And one of the other things which St Benedict would recommend is that people would have a spiritual father or a spiritual director or a confessor. That they actually sit down and that they actually talk about their spiritual life, what they're doing in their spiritual life, what they're trying to achieve, how they want to grow in the spiritual life. And so often that we really wanted to be our own spiritual director, our own confessor, our own spiritual father, our own spiritual mother. And that we really don't need anybody else. But obviously that's not the way of God, that's not the spiritual way, that's not the way of St Benedict. That you have a spiritual director, that you have a spiritual father, that you have a confessor. And sometimes people will become embarrassed, they'll become ashamed, sometimes this is just going to be through pride, that they'll do everything else except have a spiritual father or a spiritual mother or a spiritual director in their life, that they don't want to go down that path. The other thing which is very, very important for us as Christians and as Benedictines is we need to have this love of simplicity, that we're living a very, very simple life, that we're not extravagant, that we're not ostentatious, that we have a love of holy poverty. And with this is a love of generosity, that we become generous people, that we're prepared to give of ourselves. We become generous. And I remember a priest saying to me that whenever you're out as a priest, particularly whenever you dress as a priest, if somebody comes up and asks for money, you give it to them. And that can be a really hard task. That can be a really hard task. Or you give them something. Yeah, so there's always a bit of a test for them as well. Like if they might want $20, but you give them a pie, that kind of stuff. And as we've been mentioning, that we're prepared to lower ourselves. We're prepared to allow ourselves our own self-esteem. That we have that sense of humility. That we're prepared to lower ourselves. That by lowering ourselves, that means that we can grow in the spiritual life. We can grow in the love of God. So we need to humble ourselves. We need to lower ourselves in our own esteem, because sometimes we can become very, very opinionated. We can be very opinionated. And we need to have a love for God and a love for His church alone. The love of God and the love of the church alone. Because sometimes we can have that great love of worldly ostentation, so to speak, the love of the world. But we need to have a love of God, a love of the church, and also with that would be a love of the rule of St Benedict, to have that great love of it. And one of the things which it can be very, very difficult for us is to have a love of silence. And that can be very, very hard for us to have a love of silence, because we can get into the spirit of noise. And the spirit of noise, to have that spirit of noise, but to have that love of silence, that we find that time that we sit with God every day in quietness. We sit with God and in quietness, so that we can hear God speak to us. And so often we'll come home, we'll turn the radio on, we'll turn the TV on, we'll be doing everything else except for sitting in silence. When we could have that time to be silent with God. And obviously we also have this, we need to have a deep down seriousness for our spiritual life. Sometimes we can become almost neglectful of it. seriousness about our spiritual life and about our manner as well. Obviously, particularly in our modern day-to-day world today, that people will be laughing and cracking jokes, so to speak, about God, our Lord, and so often these things can become very, very attractive, and that we can be playing into the blasphemies of our time. And one of the other things which is linked to this is modesty in our words, in our demeanour, in our dress. And so often we can lose that sense of modesty, particularly in our words, to have modest conversations, to have holy conversations, to have pure conversations, purity conversations. And obviously this is linked into what we mentioned in the last one, that seriousness of our vocation as a Catholic, as a Christian, as a Benedictine. And last of all is to be humble in all our actions, that we're not trying to look for the esteem of the world, we're not trying to look for the esteem of other people, and we're not trying to build up our own self-esteem at the loss of our Christian way, of our Benedictine way. So obviously they're the 12 steps that St Benedict will be putting out for people. And this isn't just the steps for monks. These are the 12 steps that we can take in our life with God. And it's good to actually, if we can, to take one of those steps and reflect on it through the week. So that if there is one that we're being negligent in, maybe that's a step that will help us in our life with God. In nomine Patris, probably the same thing. Amen. What I might get you to do, if you can just turn that off. I pushed the wrong button, and I don't know what I've done. It's just turn the recording off. Yeah, just turn it off. I think I'm not going to get down there.